The message arrived at Mars Outpost 7 on a quiet Tuesday morning. It came through the standard diplomatic channel, formatted in the cold, careful language that the Galactic Council always used when it wanted to sound reasonable while saying something that was not reasonable at all. Colonel Dan Harris read it twice. Then he set it down on his desk and looked out the narrow window at the red dust blowing across the landing pad outside. The message was simple. Surrender 3 outer colony worlds within 48 hours or face military action. The Council called it a formal request. Dan Harris called it something else: that he had been stationed on Mars for 3 years. Before that, he had served on 2 frontier outposts and 1 deep space patrol vessel. He was not a man who panicked easily. He was also not a man who missed the meaning behind polite words that he called Lieutenant Grace Odom into his office. She was 29 years old, sharp-minded, and had a habit of solving problems before other people had finished describing them. She read the message standing up. When she finished, she looked at Harris with calm, steady eyes. Harris said they wanted a war. Grace said she had already started thinking about where to hit them first. That was the thing about the Galactic Council. They had done their homework on humanity in some ways. They knew Earth had ships. They knew humans had colonies. They knew the numbers, the population counts, the resource output of each settled world. What they had not done, what they had never bothered to do, was read the history. That the Council was made up of 17 species. Most of them had fought 1 or 2 major wars across their entire recorded history. Those wars had been terrible and had ended quickly because the losing side had asked for peace before things got too bad. The Council assumed all intelligent species worked this way. Pain led to negotiation. Enough pressure and any civilization would fold. No one on the Council had sat down and read about the 100 Years' War, or the Second World War, or the dozens of grinding, brutal conflicts humans had fought across centuries on a single small planet. No one had noticed that humanity had an entire library of experience in fighting wars where everything had gone wrong and the only option was to keep going anyway. While the Council was drafting the next diplomatic message, Dan Harris was already on a secure line to Fleet Command. Grace Odom was pulling up star maps and marking supply routes. Across the human colonies, officers who had trained for exactly this kind of moment began quietly moving ships, rerouting logistics, and activating reserve units that had been sitting on standby for years. It was done without noise. No public announcements. No visible panic. Just people who had been trained well, doing what they had been trained to do. On the Council's central station, a crystalline being named Vethra chaired the session that formally approved the military action. She reviewed the intelligence report one final time. Earth's forces were holding position. No unusual activity detected. She found this reassuring. It confirmed her belief that humanity was waiting to comply. One of her advisors, a quiet insectoid being named Cress, raised a small concern. He said the lack of visible response from Earth was unusual. Most species showed some reaction, even if only political. Vethra dismissed him gently. She had seen this before. The shock of receiving an ultimatum often left younger civilizations temporarily still. Cress said nothing more. But he made a note in his private record. He wrote that stillness in a species that had never faced this situation before was not necessarily the same as surrender. 40 light-years away, Grace Odom pinned a fresh star map to the wall of the Mars outpost and drew the first strike vector with a red marker. The line she drew was not defensive. Dan Harris looked at it for a long moment and then nodded. The 48-hour deadline passed. Earth did not comply. The Council authorized military action, confident that a brief show of force would end the matter quickly. They had no reason to think otherwise. They had never been wrong about this before. They had also never been wrong about anything quite so badly before. The Council's war fleet arrived at the edge of Earth's solar system on a Friday. 17 warships, each one larger than any vessel humanity had ever built. They came in formation, slow and deliberate, the way a hammer is raised before it falls. Sergeant Nina Cole was on duty at Luna Base when the proximity alarms went off. She was 26 years old, a combat engineer who had spent most of her career fixing things that had broken under pressure. In the next hour, she would do a great deal of that. The Council ships opened fire on humanity's most visible military targets. The large stations. The shipyards that could be seen from a distance. The Earth Defense Force headquarters on Luna, which sat in the middle of a wide plain and had always looked, to those who built it, like a reasonable thing to put at the center of your command structure. From the Council's point of view, this was sound strategy. You find the brain of the enemy and you remove it. Cut off the head and the body stops moving. It was how wars worked. It was how wars had always worked. In every conflict the Council had ever studied. The headquarters took 3 direct hits. The main communication tower went down in the first 30 seconds. 2 of the outer rings were destroyed. Half the base lost power. Nina Cole sealed 3 damaged corridors, rerouted emergency power to the command center's backup systems, and set up a functional operations post in what had previously been a maintenance bay. She did this without being told to. She did this because she had trained for it. Somewhere in a manual she had read 3 years ago, it said that when primary infrastructure failed, you used what was left. Nina had taken that seriously. 40,000 kilometers away, Fleet Commander Ray Devlin was aboard the Iron Wake when communications with Earth went dark. He waited 18 hours for orders. None came. The relay stations that would have carried those orders were gone. Ray Devlin was 51 years old. He had commanded vessels for 20 years. He did not need to be told what the silence meant. He looked at his tactical officer and said they were going to find the Council supply convoy and they were going to hit it hard. The Iron Wake, along with 3 patrol ships that had been running dark nearby, located the Council's rear supply convoy 4 hours later. They struck fast and did not stop until every supply ship in the convoy was drifting in cold. Then they pulled back before the Council's warships could respond. This was the thing the Council had not understood. Humanity's military structure was not a tree with one trunk. It was something closer to a web. Cut one strand and the others held. Destroy a headquarters and the colonels kept moving. Silence the generals and the sergeants made decisions. Every level of command had been trained, at least in theory, to function without the level above it. It was not a perfect system. It was messy and sometimes contradictory, and officers in the field made calls that headquarters would not have approved. But it worked. It kept working even after the top had been knocked off. Vethra received the battle reports in her chamber and reviewed them carefully. By every measure the Council used to assess military strikes, the attack had been a success. The primary targets had been destroyed. Enemy communication had been disrupted. The visual impact alone should have been enough to convince humanity that further resistance was pointless. And yet, the reports from the outer system told a different story. Instead of a fleet holding position and waiting for instructions, human ships were moving. Not retreating. Moving outward, spreading, hitting supply lines, probing for weaknesses. There was no chaos in it. There was, if she was honest with herself, a kind of terrible order. Cress came to her chamber that evening. He stood at the door and waited to be acknowledged, which was the polite way of saying he had something to say that she was not going to enjoy hearing. She waved him in. He told her that the loss of the headquarters appeared to have made Earth's forces more active, not less. He said he believed they had made an error in their assessment of how human command structures were designed. Vethra looked at him for a long moment. Then she told him to prepare a full analysis by morning. Cress left. Vethra sat alone with the battle report spread around her. Outside, the stars were cold and very quiet. She had been so certain this would be over in a week. 6 months into the war, the Galactic Council held a session that was supposed to be a victory review. Instead it turned into something quieter and more uncomfortable. The kind of meeting where people speak carefully because they are not ready to say what they are actually thinking. The Council had taken 2 of the 3 colony worlds they had originally demanded. On paper, this was progress. In practice, it felt like standing in a river and calling it dry ground. Every supply convoy going to those occupied worlds was being raided. Every patrol route was known before ships arrived to run it. The cost of holding what they had taken was rising faster than anyone had predicted. 4 of the 17 member species had quietly reduced their ship commitments to the war effort. They gave reasons that sounded reasonable. Stretched resources. Domestic concerns. Internal reviews. These were the polite words for something simpler. They had expected this to be over in a month and it had not been, and they were tired of paying for it. Dan Harris, now a general, ran the war from a mobile command post that moved every 72 hours. He did not stay in one place long enough for the council to target him. Grace Odom was no longer serving under him. She was running her own operation 4 star systems away, leading a small strike team that had been causing very large problems in council-held space. Grace's team had been tasked with finding the council's logistics hub at a neutral trading station called Marath Crossing. It took them 11 days to locate it. It took them 4 more days to get inside. They did not blow anything up. They were very deliberate about that. Instead, they copied the entire resupply schedule for the next 3 months and transmitted it back to Harris. Within 2 weeks, every single scheduled council convoy to the front was ambushed. Some were destroyed. Some were turned back. A few simply disappeared and were never explained. The council changed their schedules 3 times. Each time, the information found its way back to Harris within days. After the 3rd time, the council supply officers stopped trusting any communication channel they had, which created an entirely new set of problems for them. Ambassador Leon Price was doing his own kind of damage. He was not a soldier. He was a quiet, patient man who had spent 30 years learning how other species thought and what they cared about. He had been in contact with the ambassador of the Kaith for 2 months. The Kaith were one of the smaller council species, and they had never been enthusiastic about the war. They had voted for it because the other members expected them to, not because they believed in it. Price offered the Kaith a separate peace. Trade rights to 2 asteroid belts in the outer system, a formal friendship agreement, and a promise that humanity would not forget which members of the council had chosen to step back. The Kaith began withdrawing their ships from the front within a week. Kress watched all of this and wrote it down. He had been writing things down since the beginning of the war, building a picture that no one on the council wanted to look at directly. He brought his full report to Vethra on a quiet afternoon and placed it in front of her without saying anything. The report said this. By the standard models the council used to predict species behavior under military pressure, humanity should have asked for peace somewhere between the 6th and 8th week of the war. The pain threshold had been reached and exceeded. 2 colonies lost. Headquarters destroyed. Supply lines disrupted. Political isolation from the wider galactic community. By every model the council used, it was over. Humanity had not read the council's models. Humanity had, instead, gotten more organized. The longer the war went on, the tighter the supply lines became. The better coordinated the raids became. The more council member species quietly started talking to Leon Price. Kress had included one final line in his report. It said that the council had built their understanding of war around the assumption that all thinking beings, when faced with enough pain, would choose survival over resistance. He wrote that this assumption appeared to be incorrect in humanity's case, and that he did not know what to replace it with. Vethra read the report twice. Then she set it down and looked out at the stars for a long time. Grace Odom was on a stolen shuttle when Harris sent her a short message asking for a status update. She sent back 4 words, "They still have not figured it out." Harris read it at his mobile command post. He was tired and had not slept properly in 2 weeks. But he allowed himself a small, quiet smile. The council was fighting a war against a species that had been preparing for exactly this kind of war for its entire history, and the council was only now beginning to understand that. 6 months in, with no end in sight and 4 member species already pulling back, Vethra finally asked her advisors what it would take to bring humanity to the table. Kress told her that the harder question was what it would take for humanity to believe the council was serious about peace. Those were not the same thing, and the difference between them was going to matter a great deal. 9 months after the war began, the Galactic Council called for a ceasefire negotiation. The official announcement used careful, formal language. It spoke of a gesture of goodwill from the Council toward a younger civilization. It spoke of the Council's deep commitment to peace across the galaxy. It did not speak of the 4 member species that had reduced their military commitments, or the 2 that were rumored to be talking quietly to Ambassador Leon Price. Vethra had chosen the venue herself. Marath Crossing, the neutral trading station. She had picked it because it was public, because other species would be watching, and because she wanted humanity to understand that the council was doing them a favor by agreeing to meet at all. She intended to walk into that room as the stronger party and walk out with terms that looked like peace but functioned like a delayed surrender. Dan Harris arrived at Merath Crossing in his worn field uniform. Not a dress uniform. Not the kind of uniform a general wears when he wants to look impressive. The kind of uniform a man wears when he has been fighting a long time and does not feel the need to pretend otherwise. Grace Odom stood behind him, quiet and watchful. Leon Price sat to his right with a collection of data tablets arranged in a neat row on the table in front of him. The council's delegation was large and formally dressed. They had prepared opening remarks. They had prepared a list of terms. The terms were written in the way that people write things when they believe they are in charge of the conversation. Vethara opened the session. She spoke for several minutes about the council's role in maintaining galactic order, about the importance of stability, about the regrettable necessity of the military action and the council's willingness to move past it. It was a well-constructed speech. It assumed that the people listening to it were grateful to be given the chance to hear it. Harris let her finish. Then Leon Price picked up the first data tablet and slid it across the table. It contained a record of private communications between the council and one of its wavering member species. Communications that discussed pulling back from the war, the unsustainable cost of the campaign, and the possibility of reaching out to Earth independently. The kind of communications that were never supposed to leave the council's internal systems. Vethara looked at the tablet. She looked at Price. She looked at Harris. Harris said nothing. He simply waited. Price picked up the second tablet. This was the third error the council had made, and it was the one that finished them. They had entered the negotiation as if they were still winning. They had not considered that 9 months of war had not just been 9 months of fighting. It had been 9 months of Leon Price building relationships with every species in the council that had doubts. 9 months of Grace Odom and her team gathering information that was never meant to be gathered. 9 months of Dan Harris running a campaign that was as much about shaping the political landscape as it was about military action. Every piece of information on those tablets had been collected carefully, over months, by people who understood that wars are not only won on the battlefield. The council had thought they were negotiating from strength. They discovered, one tablet at a time, that the ground they thought they were standing on had been quietly moved. The council's formal delegation sat very still. Junior members looked at each other. Senior advisors looked at Vethara. Vethara looked at the tablets and felt, for the first time in 9 months, something that she had not expected to feel in this room. She felt the shape of the situation changed. It was at this point that Council Elder Soren spoke for the first time. Soren was very old, older than most of the species at the table, and had said nothing since the session began. He rose slowly from his seat and stood for a moment, looking at both sides of the table. He said that he had been observing and listening. He said that it seemed to him that one side of the table had come prepared to negotiate and the other side had come prepared to perform. He looked at Vethara with calm, old eyes. Then he said that it was time for the council to listen. The room went very quiet. Vethara sat with the data tablets in front of her, and the carefully prepared opening terms still on her screen, and the 9 months of a war that had not gone as planned pressing down on everything. Harris watched her. Grace Odom watched her. Price folded his hands and waited. Soren sat back down. And for the first time since the whole thing started, the council stopped talking and started hearing what was being said to them. The final session of the negotiation lasted 3 days. It was not easy. There were long silences and moments when people on both sides of the table said things they had to walk back and try again with different words. But it moved forward, which was the important thing, and on the morning of the 3rd day, the agreement was signed that the 2 colony worlds were returned to Earth. Humanity was granted full membership in the Galactic Council, not as a junior species with limited voting rights, but as a full member with equal standing. 3 of the Council species that had been quietly talking to Leon Price formalized new trade agreements. Several more began the process of opening official diplomatic channels. Vethara resigned her position before the ink was dry. She did not make a statement. She simply left, which was, in its own way, a kind of statement. Kress was appointed interim council liaison to humanity. It was, by the standards of council politics, a modest position. Cress did not seem to mind. He had spent 9 months watching the war from the inside and had come to believe that understanding humanity was the most important thing anyone in the council could do right now. A modest position that put him in regular contact with humans seemed, to him, like a good place to start. On the last day of the summit, Harris stood outside the negotiation chamber on a long observation deck that looked out over the stars. He was tired in the way that only comes from being responsible for something very large for a very long time. The tiredness went down to the bone. Cress found him there. The insectoid advisor stood beside him for a while without speaking, which Harris appreciated. Then Cress asked, carefully, how humanity had known the council would make those 3 errors. Harris thought about it for a moment. Then he said they had not known. They had prepared for the possibility. There was a difference. That he told Cress that from the very first day, every plan they made had accounted for 3 things. 1. Whoever they were facing might underestimate them and assume that inexperience meant weakness. 2. Whoever attacked them might strike at the wrong targets because they did not understand how human command structures were built to survive damage. 3. Whoever tried to make peace with them might come to the table thinking the war was already decided in their favor. Those 3 possibilities had been built into every plan Harris made, every decision Grace Odom took in the field, every conversation Leon Price had over 9 months of quiet diplomacy. Cress was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if humanity had ever truly doubted they would win. Harris did not answer right away. He looked out at the stars. Then he said yes. Every single day. There had been weeks where the numbers looked bad and the losses were real, and the only reason to keep going was that stopping was worse. He said doubt had never left him for the entire length of the war. Cress said that was the part the council had never understood. They had assumed that doubt was a sign of weakness, that a species carrying doubt would eventually break under it. It had not occurred to them that a species could carry doubt like weight and keep walking forward anyway. Harris said that was probably the most honest thing anyone had said about the whole situation. They stood together for a while longer without speaking. Then Harris went to find Grace Odom, who was in a small canteen 2 levels down, eating a hot meal for the first time in what felt like a month. Leon Price was already there, going through the final signed copies of the agreement with the careful attention of a man who does not believe anything is truly finished until he has read every line. Grace looked up when Harris walked in. She did not say anything dramatic. She poured him a cup of something hot and slid it across the table. Harris sat down. They were all quiet for a while, which was fine. They had said enough words over the past 9 months. 2 days later, the Iron Wake began the long journey back toward Earth. Grace Odom stood on the observation deck and watched the stars stretch into lines of light as the ship made its jump. She had the old red marker in her jacket pocket, the one she had used to draw the first strike vector on the map at Mars Outpost on the very first day of the war. She had kept it all this time without quite knowing why. She held it for a moment. Then she put it back in her pocket and watched the stars. The war was over. It had lasted 9 months and cost more than anyone liked to count. The Galactic Council would talk about it for a long time. Historians would write about the 3 errors for longer than that. And somewhere in every human military academy, in every course on strategy and planning and how to fight a war when everything is against you, someone would eventually tell the story of what happened when a species that had never stopped fighting decided they were not going to start now.